Right, so let me start with a few words and then we'll hand over to our lovely list of experts tonight. So I'm going to share some slides and just explain the background to all this. Okay. Ever since I was a small boy, there's been three things that I've just loved. One of them is galaxies, another is computers, and the third thing is space. And now here's me and Yuri Gagarin in 1961. I'm the one on the right, by the way. So those three things, galaxies, computers, and space, and until very recently, I thought they kind of joined together in a sort of harmony, and they're all crucial to my career. Then, like a lot of other people, like a lot of other professional astronomers, in 2019, we suddenly got a shock when our pictures started being photobombed by these streaks. And this is possibly the most famous example from the Dark Energy Survey. But it wasn't just professional astronomers. Amateur astronomers, stargazers were seeing this problem as well. Here's a relatively recent picture from one of our colleagues in the Astronomical Society of Edinburgh.
Andy, I think you might need to restart your slides and not advancing.
Okay. Well, we're doing brilliantly well so far. Marvelous professionalism. Suppose I share it like that rather than try to advance them. Do you see different slides then? All right, let me just do that. Okay. Right. Hello, world. So here's the story. There's three things I love ever since I was a small boy: galaxies, computers, and space. And that's me and Yuri Gagarin, both in 1961. And I'll just repeat the jokes again. That's me on the right. Okay. So until very recently, I thought these things went together in harmony, synergistically. They're all important to my own career. And in 2019, professional astronomers around the world got a bit of a shock, and our pictures started being photobombed by streaks like this. But it wasn't just professional astronomers, it was amateur stargazers as well. Here's a picture by one of our own society members here in Edinburgh. Again, the streaks invading the pictures. Now, we know why this is, of course, by now. Almost everybody knows, I think. It's because of this very exciting plan to plaster the surface of the globe in low Earth orbit with thousands of satellites, provide people with satellite dishes, and provide a kind of global internet. And in particular, we associate the name of Starlink with that idea. But it's not just Starlink. So for many years, oh, and by the way, I should say that we did invite Starlink representatives to come along to this event, but they couldn't make it. So that's a real shame. I wish somebody had been here. Satellite internet's not completely new. Some companies such as Viasat, who are represented here tonight, have been doing satellite internet for many, many years, but that's generally been done in spacecraft which are in very high orbits. So there's only a few of them. They're not too bright, and but there's a bit of a time delay in the signal that comes down from such satellites. Now, the new idea, and this graphic, by the way, is from the OneWeb company who are represented on our event tonight. And it illustrates that the new thing is having a fleet of satellites much closer to the Earth. And then you cut down the delays in the signals, and we'll try and understand later why that is, why some people think that's important. But then each satellite can only see a little bit of the Earth, so you need thousands of them. Okay, so the problem really is not just Starlink, even though some people have got very, astronomers and others have got cross with them. Everybody else is now jumping on the bandwagon. Lots of other companies, lots of countries, in China, Russia, Facebook, and Amazon. And if you add up all the proposals that are in public knowledge for fleets of satellites providing space internet, you come to the conclusion that something like 100,000 satellites will be up there by 2029. So compared to 2018, that's a factor of 50 increase in the number of satellites in low Earth orbit. So this is a scarily fast change, which is why people are very concerned, and it's hard to know where it's going to stop. Now, many of our professional astronomy colleagues, for example, Connie Walker, who's on the event tonight, got together, worked very hard on technical working groups. We're talking with SpaceX engineers and with people at OneWeb as well, who were very accommodating and useful. And Connie was the lead author of this report, which went to the United Nations quite recently. And it's a fantastic piece of work. So if you're really interested, you should try and read it. I took a slightly different approach. I decided to go with raising public awareness. So I wrote this book, which some of you will have seen, as a non-technical explanation of the issues, and then set up this event here, again, to try and make it as public as possible. But it's much broader than just astronomical pictures. It's about space junk, debris in space, which people have been hearing more and more about, especially in recent weeks with the hit on the International Space Station. This is a problem that's been growing for many years. People have been concerned. Here's a picture Mark McCaughrean sent me of a hole in one of the solar panels of the Hubble Space Telescope, made by a relatively small piece of debris. People are also seeing this as an environmental problem, a kind of pollution of the wilderness, as it were. And unlike light pollution, which is relatively localized, you can get away from it, satellite pollution is global. It doesn't matter where the satellites were launched from, they fly over your sky in an hour's time. It also, some people are seeing this more and more as a kind of cultural problem about humanity's right to the sky. And we have some people on the event tonight who'll tell us more about that. This is an Australian Aboriginal constellation marked on the sky, the Emu. It's also about liability and possible damage. This picture is showing a piece of an iridium satellite which fell into a Californian orchard, and also showing some Canadian scientists looking for the remains of a radioactive Russian satellite which crashed into northern Canada. And we really need to kind of sort out what the rules are, who's responsible for that, whether the liability convention that exists in international law works. The whole situation, I'm nearly finished, by the way, we'll hand over in a second. The whole situation reminds me of earlier in my life during the 1970s, when the law of the sea was a hot topic and building up. Those of you who are old enough will remember Cod Wars, disputes over seabed exploitation and so on. And it was really getting quite nasty. And there was a big shake-up in international regulations, which is not finished yet, by the way, I think. Still a live issue. But it's much better than it was. So I suspect we're going through a similar transformation in space. So our event tonight is divided into 5 sections. We're going to start by talking about astronomical science, why astronomers care. Then we're going to talk to some satellite operators and try and understand what it's all about and what they're doing. Then we're going to talk about environment and culture more broadly. Then we'll look specifically at space junk. And then finally, we'll look at space law and policy and what the world can and should do. Okay, so that's enough for me in the end of the slides. We're going to pass now to our first panel. This is led by Mark McCaughrean, together with Sam Lawler, Meredith Rawls, and Michael Kramer. So I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining in this evening. So just to introduce myself, I'm the Senior Advisor for Science and Exploration at the European Space Agency. Of course, we operate telescopes in space, as well as all sorts of other missions. And in fact, these are images taken by the Hubble Space Telescope, which Andy showed a little bit earlier. And we have Meredith Rawls from the University of Washington, who's involved in the Vera Rubin Observatory, which is a new, very wide field survey telescope, which can be looking across a lot of the sky from one location very rapidly, taking lots of images in great detail. We have Sam Lawler from the University of Regina in Canada, and she works on disks and Kuiper belt objects and how we can understand our planetary system in the context of exoplanet systems. And Michelle Kramer, who is director at the Max Planck Institute for Radio Astronomy in Bonn, involved in pulsars, but also in new big projects, so LOFAR and SKA. So I'm not sure, I'm still seeing you, Andy, as the main person here. So I'm not sure if it's been switched over by Mark so that we're on screen.
You are on screen, yeah.
Good, great. So let me start with an opening question then, Meredith. And Andy sort of partly addressed this, but keeping in mind the general audience, aren't there just loads of satellites in space already? You know, couldn't we have anticipated this problem? We've had telescopes on the ground for a long time. Why is this a big problem all of a sudden? It's partly the satellites, I think, but also what we're planning for new facilities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you're right that there have been satellites, launched into space since the 50s now at this point. But the change that's happening in the last couple of years has been a huge increase in the number of satellites being launched and the number of satellites that are planned to be launched. And everybody, including the satellite operators themselves, have been surprised to see how bright these satellites are. They can be illuminated well after sunset because the sun is still reflecting off of the satellite body or the solar panels of the satellite. And so they can be very bright to ground-based observers, even in the nighttime.
Okay, and specifically, you're working on a project which is, let's call it, more vulnerable than others, but it's not the only project of its kind around. So why explicitly, as we're building these big new telescopes, is this sort of even a double issue?
Yeah, so I primarily work for Rubin Observatory, which is this wonderful 6.5 meter telescope under construction in Chile. It's going to survey the whole night sky, like you were saying, in full color. It's going to help us find really deep, faint sources, really interesting moving variable sources. But all of the really cool ways that we're designing Rubin Observatory to be able to find these amazing new phenomena is also the exact same characteristics that make it really vulnerable to large numbers of bright low Earth orbit satellites. And that's simply because it has a really wide field of view. So you're more likely to get a satellite streak across any given image that you take. And it also has a large mirror, makes it very sensitive to things that are even relatively faint.
Great. So Sam, let's talk a little bit about the specifics of the kinds of things we're looking for in astronomy today. Are all observations affected equally? I mean, on one hand, we can take very deep field images and kind of stack the images and get rid of satellite trails, but other sorts of projects really can't do that. So talk us through some of the projects which are even more vulnerable than generic astronomy.
Yeah. So in my area of astronomy, so I try to find Kuiper belt objects in the distant solar system, right? So these are very, very faint. I'm using wide field imaging. So the Vera Rubin Observatory will be awesome for this kind of astronomy. And so I need to stare at a spot on the sky for a few minutes to gather enough light to see these really faint objects. And during that time, many satellites could fly through the field of view that are millions of times brighter than the very faint objects that I'm trying to find. So yeah, wide field astronomy will be the most strongly affected. There are different types of astronomy that will not be as strongly affected, but could have really big consequences if a satellite does fly through. So trying to find exoplanets right next to a star, you have a very small field of view, but your instrument is incredibly sensitive. So the odds of a satellite flying through are small, but if it does, it could really damage your instrument, right? So there's a couple of examples for you.
I mean, I was also thinking about NearEarth Asteroids and observing at twilight, because these satellites are visible at twilight predominantly, and that affects certain observations really a lot, right? Because that's the prime time for looking for things.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, near Earth objects are most easily found close to twilight. which is when satellites are the brightest and are going to cause the most confusion, right? And finding near-Earth objects is, I would argue, the most directly important part of astronomy, right? Like protecting our planet from something that could potentially kill everything on the planet, right? So this is not an area of astronomy we want to mess with. It's important.
Michelle, let's bring you in. So we've talked about the visible impact, the fact that human beings can see these satellites fly across the sky and our very sensitive optical infrared telescopes, but it's a big problem for radio astronomers as well. And so talk us through why that is. I mean, I can't see in the radio, you know, who cares, right? And there are protected frequency bands. Why don't astronomers just stick to those and let the telecoms operators do what they want to do? But it's just not that simple, is it?
No, it's not. I mean, the problem with radio astronomers is it's not just a streak in your data. If you have a satellite signal in your data, it's basically blinding the whole telescope, and you cannot just edit the data. So the problem is, of course, we have developed along with radio technology, and yes, a lot of the there are some bands protected, and we have learned to share part of the spectrum. But the protected spectrum is only about 1% of the frequencies that we really want to look at. And a satellite is 1 billion times stronger than a normal radio source we try to look at today, and not even speaking about the next generation of telescopes like the SKA. So we have tried to build the SKA, for instance, in radio protected zones where there is no emission, but it's only emission on the ground. And nothing protects you from satellites. They're everywhere. So, and it's just the sheer number of satellites that suddenly appears. In the past, we could organize our observations maybe to avoid some satellites, but that won't be impossible anymore in the future.
Yeah. There's also this concern, right, that, you know, in a way, these huge numbers of satellites, which are relatively cheap, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but there's this possible danger that some of the electronics are broadcasting, leaking outside the protected frequency bands. And that's, I think, an issue which people haven't appreciated enough.
It's absolutely true. And we have experienced bad experience in the past where exactly that happened. And that happened only for well-built satellite. Now we have all these cheap satellites. And we're not only talking about OneWeb or SpaceX or whatever, but also these nanocubes. They're equally cheap, and they have much more danger than the current generation of satellites. So it's really the probability that one of these satellites goes rogue, so to speak, and is polluting the protected signal spectrum. Once it's up there, it's very difficult to fix, if not impossible to fix. Then we have to live with it. It's impossible.
Right. Meredith, let's come back to the optical side, because as Michal said, you know, it blinds you across the whole, you know, the whole sky effectively, but we're only seeing streaks of light in the visible and the infrared. You know, why can't we just stack images and get rid of them? I mean, is there a specific issue with the hypersensitive telescopes and detectors and electronics that we have?
Sure. So there's a couple of things there. It is possible in some situations to do, as you say, to stack the images and use algorithms to detect linear features and remove them or mask them or not use those pixels in all scientific analyses. The problem becomes that sometimes what you want to measure is actually a really faint, subtle background noise level measurements in order to do cosmology and other really important studies. And if you have, you know, kind of crisscross spaghetti stripes all over your background, then you're not going to be able to do those studies. You're not going to be able to figure out how fast the universe is expanding, or, you know, the fate of our universe is this kind of study you won't be able to do in that situation with that data set. The other issue that you get into is that that's not the only kind of science you want to do, right? Sometimes you're going to miss things, like Sam was saying earlier, right? If you're trying to find a supernova and it happens to be behind a satellite streak, you're out of luck. So,
yeah, and there's also this issue with the electronics saturating to the point where there's a bleed over from one detector into another. If the satellites are really bright, and some of these near Earth, you know, these LEO satellites that only have 350 kilometers high, they're really bright, right?
That's true. Yeah, so saturation can be a concern. What we've seen with some of the Starlink satellites specifically so far is that, at least for Rubin Observatory, is what I'm most familiar with. Well, we don't have data from Rubin Observatory yet, but precursor surveys like the Dark Energy Camera, they're similar. We don't see saturation as a main problem for the satellites that are already up at their final operational orbits. Those are still not as faint as we would like them to be, but they're not bright enough that they will saturate the detector. Instead, you get more subtle effects, like you can get a nonlinear electronic crosstalk effect that is hard to correct for perfectly. So, and again, this is the kind of thing that can lead to systematic biases kind of creeping into your data analysis.
Right. So it's not only ground-based telescopes, of course, but space-based telescopes get to see these trails. And in fact, they get to see them in weird ways because Hubble is close enough to some of the orbits of these satellites that the streaks are actually out of focus. The objects are so wide, they cover huge amounts of the detector real estate. But a thing that's often said, Michael, let me bring it to you, because it is that we should just move all astronomy into space, that we should get above the low Earth orbit and go and put telescopes on the far side of the moon. Some of our telescopes, of course, are millions of kilometers away, like the Gaia mission. But that, that's not entirely practical, is it? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. And it's not practical for radio astronomy, where we need really big apertures to collect all the photons. They're low energy photons, so you need to collect a lot of them. And so the biggest telescope will have collecting area of a square kilometer, and try to build that in space. So yes, the moon is probably the only protected side, the backside of the moon in the whole solar system. And whether this is cheap, I doubt it. And it's very difficult to get the data back. So you may have satellites around the moon to bring the data back. So that feeds the purpose. So it's not practical at all, I would say.
Yeah. And the Chinese are now building a new space telescope in low Earth orbit as well. It's not as if everything's going to L2 or further away.
Exactly.
So the last question before we take questions from the panelists. Sam, it's not only about us as professionals as well, right? The amateur astronomers, this was mentioned right at the beginning by Mark. It's not true that out of sight is out of mind, even for the amateur astronomers. I can't see them with the naked eye, therefore. So talk a little bit about that. What are amateur astronomers doing in the crossover to professional astronomy, which is important?
Well, I mean, astrophotography is strongly affected by the same reasons, right? You point a telescope at a spot on the sky, and many satellites fly through in that period of time. Yeah, just stargazing is affected by this, right? Just going outside and, so I live in rural Saskatchewan. This is the first place I've ever lived where I can walk out my back door and see the Milky Way at night. And it's incredible. I so appreciate that. But I have noticed, even just in the last year, more satellites, right? So it is noticeable. To the naked eye, it is very noticeable with a small telescope, and it is, incredibly almost destructive with a large telescope. So,
great. Well, thanks all three. We're open now to questions, Andy. I'm not sure how you're going to bring those over to us.
So I'll just read some interesting things out that I've seen. So I'll go straight to one from the public on YouTube. Somebody's asked me something a lot of people come up with. SpaceX did this experiment of plating satellites black. So doesn't that just take care of the problem? We just make them dark.
So we tried that. They tried that with one satellite. Sorry if it's okay for me to jump in. It was called DarkSat, interestingly enough, and it made it a little darker, but not dark enough. And there's a whole study that I helped with to measure the brightness of that satellite relative to other ones. And it turns out that it also wasn't a viable solution for SpaceX because the satellite got too hot, and then it wasn't able to operate as well as it should. So they switched. Yeah, so they switched to trying a visor to kind of reflect the sunlight. And it's really great that they've been willing to work with astronomers to try these different technical mitigations. It's conceivable that some other company could say, we don't care about astronomy at all. We're going to launch lots of bright things no matter what. Too bad for you. And so it's really been good that the engineers at SpaceX have been willing to cooperate with astronomers and collaborate to try to mitigate the brightness. We're not at a place yet that I would say they have fully succeeded in coming up with a technical mitigation that will make it dim enough, especially when the satellites are being launched. There's like a couple weeks where they're still getting up to their final orbits. That is a whole other situation that still needs to kind of be addressed.
I'll add one thing to that myself, that the SpaceX people have been accommodating. They've tried, but in the future, if there's just, Chinese companies, Russian companies, random people from Brazil we've never heard of, we don't know what they're going to do. Stuart Eves had a good question, which is that even if we manage to limit the satellite's optical and radio frequency brightness, is it still a problem for infrared astronomy?
Well, yeah, let me talk to that. This is obviously an issue, and Meredith touched on it, right? Photons go in, photons have to come out, right? I mean, they either get absorbed and re-emitted at longer wavelengths, and the NEO-WISE satellite has been seeing satellite trails in space as well. I haven't looked specifically at ground-based infrared observations to see if they're having a problem, but broadly speaking, you know, in the near infrared out to 2 microns, they're going to be just similarly affected. We are beginning to see some color differences. So we are actually seeing with Hubble that you're seeing brighter trails in the infrared wavelengths, optical infrared, let's say. So it doesn't help. You're still going to get hurt in the infrared.
Okay, that's pretty clear. So another question a lot of people are asking, but I think it's not right for this session. People are already saying, well, how do we reconcile that? You know, there are remote areas where people don't have internet access and so on. And that's true, but we'll come to that in the next section, I think.
Can I make a very brief comment about that?
Just brief.
Yeah,
we're in Canada.
Yeah, I live in rural Canada. So like there are other options, right? We shouldn't have to choose between astronomy and having rural internet, right? There are other ways to do this, and there's fantastic engineers who can work on solutions to make these satellites fainter. So
yeah, great. Yeah, let's do both. but I'm sure we will come back to that question. Catherine's asked, as well as the space question, which you addressed, Mark, already. You know, do you see people saying, well, why don't you just send telescopes to the moon?
Yeah, well, the moon's an absolutely horrendous place to do things, and we're struggling at the moment to try and work out how we put humans back there. I mean, dust is a major problem, and on the moon, it's really nasty kind of dust. It's not rounded pebbles like on a small scale dust is on the Earth. It's incredibly sharp, nasty stuff, and it cuts through electronics cables, gets in suits, it gets all over mirrors. But it's, you know, vastly expensive, and this debate keeps coming up. Well, you know, the billionaires will just pay for you to build all your telescopes in space from the proceeds of their satellite constellation. And I think, that's not the world I live in, so I'm not really sure that I trust that kind of benevolence is going to be something that we expect. And, you know, our telescopes are built by the taxpayer, and so this is a taxpayer issue, right? What do you want to see in your balance overall? It wouldn't be our decision alone to say, yeah, move everything into space, but it's going to cost you 50 times as much.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's taxpayers' dollars.
I like to think euros, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I know it's just a familiar phrase. That's right. It annoys the Canadians as well as the Dutch. So I think, you know, I was thinking of commenting. We should move on in a second, but if we're being honest with the world, you know, I think we shouldn't give the impression that it's, you know, destroying the sky right now. It's not that bad. It's already annoying for amateurs and professionals, but it's not that bad. It's a question of where the hell is this going to stop? You know, we have no way to understand how bad it's going to get. And I know that Sam and Aaron and Stefano as well worked very hard on making predictions for where this might go. So for me, that's the big thing. And we must be careful not to overplay how awful it is now, because it isn't yet, you know, but we know it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So anyway, that was a bit of a speech, sorry. Kern Kaiken online is asking, is Earth observation from satellites also affected badly?
There are some frequencies where it is. For example, if you want to measure water in the upper atmosphere looking down with your satellites, you get radio interference, and that can definitely pollute some of the observations. It tends not to be an issue, of course, for satellites taking images of the ground. But it's when you're using radio frequencies, that's when it can become a problem for Earth observation. And we have satellites that do that.
Okay.
Quite apart from the fact we nearly get hit by things as well, but that's another issue. We've got that later on.
Great. Well, look, I think we should move on to the next section, but this has been fantastic already. You know, I'm sure public conversation will continue. But let's move on to part 2. I'm just going to very briefly share this slide to remind you of who's coming up. So this is who we have now. The next chair is Catherine Heymans, new Astronomer Royal for Scotland. And we have representatives from OneWeb and Viasat. So I'm very excited about this. And we're going to talk about, you know, why this is happening and what's the right way to do it. I don't know what's going to come up, but it's going to be good. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. Well, I am very delighted to introduce 2 incredibly experienced professionals from the data communications industry. We have with us this evening Ruth Pritchard-Kelly. She's a senior advisor for regulatory affairs at OneWeb. She's advising legal and technical policy analysts who are working on satellite policy, and 30 years of experience in the area. We're delighted to have Ruth with us. She also works on the US Commerce Department's Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, which is a mouthful, and she's also on the board of the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation. So Ruth, thanks for joining us. We've also got Amy Mehlman. Now she's leading Viasat's government relation efforts in the United States, and she's helping determine its global policy strategies. Another 25 years of experience. Amy's been advising business leaders across satellite, wireless, telecom, equipment sectors, and she's represented innovators before the US Congress, different federal agencies, and the executive branch or in the US, as well as international regulatory and legislative branches. Crikey, it is a genuine pleasure to meet you both. Let's start off with Amy. What I'd like you to do, Amy, is introduce us to your company Viasat. Tell us how you're currently using satellite technology to connect our world.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me, Andy, for sure, and Catherine for moderating the panel. And I think I've aged myself completely with my bio, but hopefully the picture was better. Anyway, look, Viasat has been around for quite some time, since about 1985, when our founders sort of founded it in their garage type thing. It's a great American story here, but we, embarked on a mission to connect the world. Mostly we've been focusing on geostationary satellites to do so. We have a fleet of geostationary satellites, both in orbit, but also in production. Our Viasat 3s are looking to provide coverage. The first one over the Americas, the second one over the EMEA region, and the third, within a couple of years over the APAC region. And really the idea was to, get the cost per bit down such that, those who were struggling to, afford connectivity or even, have any reach for connectivity could do so in an affordable manner. So, we believe that geostationary satellites were, probably best to do that. Now, as Ruth will probably tell you as well, and we certainly see this for, clients of ours, customers of ours that we build for. We know that there are some low latency applications that need to be addressed, and so those are being addressed by folks like OneWeb and us as well. We are looking at systems such as those as well. We do a lot of work in the antenna business as well. So there are a lot of issues that we've been focusing on, many of which you have been in this conference already, and will do so as we continue. Mostly on orbital debris, certainly how to solve these problems from a light pollution perspective. And what is the landscape going to look like? What are the rules going to look like surrounding all of this? And how are we going to all coexist together? And that's really our goal, is to work with, our industry, your industry, and, figure out how best to connect the world while doing it safely. So look, I really appreciate you guys having us, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Thanks, Amy. So I'm going to take a pause in the question there, just ask you to define something. So you use the term low latency there for people who aren't up on the jargon terms. Can you explain what that means for us?
Sure. I mean, so if you're looking at a geostation, I mean, it's physics, right? If you're looking at a geostationary satellite, the time for you to connect to the ground is going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more of a lag than it would be from a low Earth orbit satellite. Although we're talking, 600 milliseconds difference, something like that, 700 maybe, depending. But I do think that, the policies around low latency applications have really been driving the surge of LEO systems and their push to launch. I mean, for example, in the
LEO system is low Earth orbit.
Low Earth orbit systems. I apologize. Yes, yes. So acronyms, we need like a money jar for acronyms, but this is DC. We always, we do this. Anyway, but there's, funding mechanisms and everything, and they're putting a premium on low latency applications. So that's sort of helping drive things. Although, again, I'll pass it over to Ruth next, but I'm sure will tell you a lot about, some of the other needs, connectivity needs that are driving this as well.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, Ruth, so let me invite you to introduce us to your company, OneWeb. How does your approach to global communications differ from Viasat and this geostationary orbit?
Thank you so much, Catherine. And Amy, obviously we know each other well. And despite my accent, OneWeb is very much a UK system. So that's one of the primary differences. There are technical differences. There are sort of business plan differences. What market are you headed toward? And there are political differences. And all of these have led to this plethora, really, of systems right now, right? And so there are 5 or 6 truly viable systems being proposed. Starlink has started to launch. OneWeb has started to launch. Forgive me, it seems like my internet connection may not be great. Apologies. Samantha, I'm glad you've got good connectivity in rural Canada, but I assure you, the First Nations in the far north have been begging for these systems to come along. And so when Amy talks about latency, everybody knows what it's like to talk on a satellite connection for a voice call, right? There's a delay. And everybody knows what it's like to try to check your bank account via a geostationary satellite. You time out. So you need low latency. You need almost no delay. And that's why Telesat from Canada, OneWeb from the UK, Amazon, Viasat, and Starlink, all out of the United States. I can't remember the Russian system, but they've got one planned. The Chinese have 3, right? So they won't all come to fruition, but because of political reasons, you're going to see probably 3, right? So there'll be a US system, and there will be people who don't want to use or aren't allowed to use a US licensed system, right? And the same for a Chinese system. They're going to have one because they'll have needs that they feel insecure using a non-Chinese built and licensed system. So there are, unfortunately, political issues. Technically, we're all trying something different, right? So the OneWeb satellites orbit the poles. They look like lines of longitude on your globe. And we call each one of those lines a plane. We think it will take us roughly 600 satellites at 1,200 kilometers to serve the globe. But honestly, Catherine, we're all doing this pretty much for the first time. Viasat doesn't think it will take that many satellites. Starlink, God bless them, have asked for 42,000, right? So that's probably, forgive the school bus, that's probably crazy talk, okay? I don't think anyone thinks it'll need that, but it's scary. It is scary in the very conversation that we are having because everybody likes the skies. I mean, I like the skies. And to think inadvertently that our plans to connect the world, which is incredibly idealistic, right? We see connectivity to the internet as a human right also, right? Information, access to information. We couldn't have this call without connectivity to the internet. You couldn't warn the world of an impending meteor strike without connectivity. So we need it. All of us need it. And it really is a conversation. We are with the StarCon 2 group. We are with various observatories around the world. We are devastated that our plans to aid the world have inadvertently caused a real problem. So definitely the discussion continues. We are in our Gen 1 right now. Gen 2, there could be things, there should be things that we can do with the design. For example, fewer satellites that are more powerful, right? And so it's a numbers game. The more objects there are, the harder it is for astronomers, right? Yeah. And we're talking live satellites and especially debris, right? So the real problem with a 42,000 satellite constellation is as they age out, right now, the international guidelines give them 25 years to get out of space. right? That's crazy. Do you know how many dead satellites they'll have perfectly legally unless we update those international guidelines, right? So we as a world need to work together, and we as OneWeb really deeply want to make sure that we're doing the responsible things.
Thanks, Ruth. I mean, I think that sort of echoes what Meredith was saying earlier, that it's great to see these companies working together with astronomers. But Amy, let me just come back to you. So Ruth said that OneWeb is looking at 600 of these satellites. We are looking at these headlines about SpaceX. Unfortunately, we did invite them to join us tonight, but unfortunately they couldn't make us. So they already have 1,500 satellites up there, approved plans to launch 12,000. What does that offer us? I mean, Viasat has fewer than OneWeb, and SpaceX is, as Ruth was saying, so many more. So what is Starlink going to be able to offer us with those tens of thousands that Viasat and OneWeb can't? Is there anything that it can do differently?
I don't think so, to be honest. I mean, I think we have been pushing for rules to contain this to some degree, because I don't think that's needed. And what I'm fearful of is that it actually promotes the exact wrong thing. And this is getting to what Ruth was saying, right? If you can come up with some binding rules that sort of manage what is safe, what is acceptable, both from a communication standpoint, from a national security standpoint, from a light pollution standpoint, all of these things included, I think you're going to get to a place where you're driving people toward fewer, more capable satellites. And what does that mean? I mean, if you look at what the FCC did, the Federal Communications Commission in the United States, they've made some decisions, including allowing up to 12,000 SpaceX satellites. And the result of that really is the reaction that you're seeing, for example, in China. I mean, they in fact specifically said that their systems are in reaction to the Elon Musk system. So if you just look at the percentages of what the US has from a geostationary standpoint, the numbers of satellites that they have probably 20 to 40% of the satellites out there today, right? Separate that from SpaceX, just what had existed. Right now, they've actually approved almost 50,000 if you look at it in total. Extrapolate that to the rest of the world. You may end up seeing somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 satellites in LEO orbit. That's unsustainable. A small percentage of that is probably unsustainable. Everything has to be perfect in order for it to actually coexist, right? Everybody's
because we're running short on time.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I want to get to the essence of this latency issue. Ruth was mentioning it, the slow satellite phone. Is that the difference? Why does SpaceX want all of these very, very low Earth orbits? Is it to do with the very fast latency or fast speeds that you get from that? Is that the technical difference here, Ruth?
No, all of the LEOs are offering lower latency. So the Viasat LEO, Telesat, OneWeb, they're all going to be the equivalent of 4G quality connection, right? That is the idea, and they'll provide 5G for the most part when that's been standardized. I think that SpaceX might be more, well, it's similar to another concern, fast fashion or disposable, right? You buy something cheap at Primark and you throw it away a month later, as opposed to buying something incredibly expensive that lasts for 50 years. So SpaceX is doing cheap, fast, get them up quickly. If they fail, I don't care, launch something better. And they want massive amounts of capacity in small, cheap satellites. Whereas Viasat and OneWeb and some of the others are saying, no, test it on the ground, for God's sake, get it right, make it larger and more powerful to begin with. And so we're only going to need, and as I said, our Gen 1 is planned for about 550 on orbit with spares. we are hoping truly that Gen 2 will be fewer satellites, right? Because they'll be more powerful and you won't need as many, especially since we're now aware that it is a light pollution problem, if not a radio pollution problem, right? So I'm telling you, nobody wants to hurt the astronomers or astronomy.
I'm feeling very comforted. I'm feeling very comforted, Andy. We have a very short amount of time for questions from the panelists.
Yeah, so there are a few questions in the chat and in the YouTube. There's a lot of discussion about is latency really what you need, or isn't it just bandwidth? And couldn't you do that from geo perhaps?
And again, if I may, as Amy said, quite a few applications, especially if it's a one-way broadcast or you don't need a quick response in return, absolutely can be done from geostationary, and that would be a better technology, right? And some things you're close enough to a city center and you can do them with fiber or cellular mobile, and that would be a better technology, right? But in between are areas where you can't lay fiber, they're mountainous or they're over the water. Or it's too expensive. It's not going to happen. How are you best going to cover those parts of the globe? That's what you need the LEO satellites for. And honestly, you cannot check your bank account if the delay is too long. So these are real concerns. You cannot do somebody's health check or their blood pressure via a geostationary satellite if the delay is too long. So there are different applications for different technologies.
Yeah, can I just add just real quick? I would say that these things are complementary of each other, right? So I do think that geo provides an extreme amount of capacity over a large area, and then there are the applications that are much needed from a low latency perspective that can complement the geo or vice versa. So I do think you could have a smaller number of the LEOs, in the geos, and then you have a great system. But the rules that are put out there will decide everything.
Another question from Catherine Courtney. What do the panel think is getting in the way of agreeing internationally binding rules? Surely operators also want to achieve a safe operating environment.
Politics are an issue. I think that operators are very concerned about collisions and debris. Obviously, we lose money if either of those things happen. So it's not in our own personal interests to have a collision or to cause debris. But are the Chinese going to share their location ephemeris with the US military? Probably not, right? And so how do you get that global consensus?
Yeah, I would agree to a large extent with Ruth, although I do think that, some have different plans than others as far as how they do things and how they design and test and operate their systems. And, some of these binding rules may be more preclusive for some rather than others. And so that's where those politics come in.
And one more question from both from Joseph Sabera and John Frame are concerned about dead satellites and removing old satellites. And for example, isn't there a significant failure rate? Why not have an international policy that works like carbon offsetting, that if you launch a satellite, you have to pay to bring some other satellites down?
That's a very clever idea. And I would say that the community is working toward debris removal, right? So I know ESA has a program that OneWeb is involved in. And Astroscale and Clear Sky, the sort of debris removal industry is definitely kicking into high gear. OneWeb has designed its satellites with a magnetic grappling feature such that when they need to be retrieved and when the industry is mature enough, we will be able to hire a company to go and remove the debris. I think we should not only, leave no trace of our current constellation, but I agree that as a world, as a global community, we need to clean up what we left there before.
Yeah.
And I think we have to move on probably. So one final question here about land grabs. There's a sense that some of the FCC and ITU filings are for large numbers of satellites that maybe are just trying to shut other companies out and aren't really, is there really a need for these hundreds of thousands of satellites? So
first of all, I think that's actually a really huge concern. I do. I think that, we're in a, first in type situation. I mean, there are not rules such as they were, for example, for geostationary satellites. They had sort of the spacing rules, through the ITU. That took a long time. And unfortunately, we're in a situation now where the rules aren't necessarily there in place and could take some time, and technology is kind of passing this by. So unless you're dealing with some of these issues and rules and interference concerns at the national level to deal with this, impending concern, I don't think you're going to get to where you need to be in the short term. I think the ITU is working on some of these issues, but it's not going to come in time for what we need for the pace of the launches that are happening today.
Well, okay, actually, if I could just interject quickly. In fact, at the last World Radio Conference, the ITU did create for the first time, build out milestones for the LEO constellation, so that if you ask for, say, 42,000 satellites, you have 7 years. You have to have 10% up in 3 years and 50% in 5. And if you don't have, say, 4,200 satellites up in your 3 years, however much you have will become your 10%. So it will effectively become your new 10% and thus limit the amount. And what's going to happen there is you don't have the money, or there isn't the demand. You're not going to build that enormous system, right? And so I think this is actually a great set of new rules out of the ITU for the constellations.
So I'm going to jump in there. This has been a fantastic session, actually, and very interesting responses from our industry representatives here. And there's been to me a couple of very interesting points from Moriba about tracking data, but we'll come back to that later, Moriba, okay? Now, so let's move on to part 3. This is also very exciting. I'm really looking forward to this. So here we are. Environment and culture, the broader issues. This is going to be chaired by Jarita Holbrook. We've got Timiyabi Aganaba, Brian Eno, and Aparna Venkatasan. So over to you, Jarita.
Good evening. Yes, this is going to be exciting. I'm Jarita Holbrook. I'm part of the Science, Technology, and Innovation Studies here at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm currently the president of the International Society for Archaeoastronomy and Astronomy and Culture. We have 3 speakers today. Professor Timiyabi Aganaba, killing it, is part of the School of the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University. Timiyabi has held many important roles, including working with the Canadian and Nigerian space agencies, the International Space University, and the World Space Week Association. Our second speaker is Brian Eno. He's an internationally recognized artist, perhaps best known for his musical successes. Brian uses his art to shift public perceptions of issues like global warming and climate change. And our last speaker is Aparna Venkatasan. I don't think I've ever said your last name before, Aparna. She's a cosmologist and professor of physics and astronomy at the University of San Francisco. Aparna works actively on developing scientific partnerships with indigenous communities and on advocating for a sustainable presence in near-Earth space and preserving the skies as a scientific, environmental, and cultural resource. Our first question goes to Professor Aganaba. In the context of environment and culture, what is our right to the sky? And should we care about our right to the sky?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. This is a fascinating conversation so far. So I'm basically a lawyer, so I think this rights discourse is very interesting. So essentially we have 2 proposed rights that are pushing against each other: the right to be connected versus the right to a dark and quiet sky. Now, I think COVID-19 showed us the extent of the digital divide problem, right? Those connected were able to maintain business or find new opportunities and continue their education, And those who were not, whether in rural areas, indigenous communities, or developing countries, found themselves further marginalized. So basically in 2017, the UN declared that it considers the internet to be a human right. So specifically, an addition was made to Article 9 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, basically stating this. Noble, but the question is, should this goal for universal human right, the universal human right of internet, be met at all costs? So accordingly, the participants in the International Conference in Defense and Quality of the Night Sky and the Right to Observe the Skies in a meeting in Spain in 2007 had a different view about what is an important human right and declared that an unpolluted night sky should be considered as an inalienable right of humankind, equivalent to other environmental, social, and cultural rights. So now the International Astronomical Union have taken this issue of light pollution to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, requesting that they protect the sky's darkness for the sake of future advancements in astronomy. But of course, astronomy is obviously just one stakeholder. But how do we balance these supposed conflicting rights? For the space industry, they argue that there is no hierarchy to space activities, right? That no one can say astronomy is more important than the internet, and everyone is free to explore space subject to the Outer Space Treaty. But as Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty highlights, the freedom of outer space is subject to the condition that space be explored and used for the benefit and interest of all countries. So in this case, what is benefit and who gets to decide? And we really must promote dialogue to ensure that not only do space activities continue to be beneficial for all humanity, but that includes deciding when increased activity is not in the benefit of humanity. So on the other hand, there are others who are arguing that we should start thinking of space as an environment to be protected. So some space sustainability advocates argue that the environment of space has value itself, or intrinsic value, and faces a much greater risk of harm than individuals on Earth. So while the question of intrinsic rights of nature, like rivers and trees and the like, have now been given legal protection in some jurisdictions, the question of the protection of the space environment is finally making it to court. And it's very interesting, as Amy slightly alluded to, Viasat is requesting an injunction or a motion to stay against the launch of SpaceX Starlink satellites, citing that the Federal Communications Commission are in violation of the National Environmental Protection Act by not requesting an environmental impact assessment to determine the risk of Starlink satellites. Now, the question is, what is environment for the purposes of this NEPA Act? And does space qualify? And the big issue is that the qualifier to environment is that it must be a human environment. I mean, when I started digging into this, there are really interesting articles that focus on current understandings of the conception of human environment, especially in the context of Black Lives Matter, which focus on the non-physical effects to people. And as such, we can see that it is arguable whether the space environment is a human environment. I mean, it is certainly a domain, but is a domain an environment, and is a domain human? Humans operate in a domain, but is it all the same thing? But even more basic, when I think about this, it seems there's no available measure of what amounts to an environmental concern. So this may depend on human sociological and psychological factors, as well as the way a movement is portrayed as being environmental by proponents of the view. So I'm going to cut it short here because I know that I'm going on. But basically, we need to come to an agreement if there is an environmental concern in outer space. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, jumping right in, Brian, you have made your commitment to climate change and trying to encourage other musicians through your Earth Percent initiative. In your mind, what's the connection with the satellite pollution issue? Are they completely different problems or somehow connected?
I'm unmuted now, sorry. I think they're very closely connected. This seems to me to be a question of how do we think about the commons? Now, what we've seen over the last 50 years in particular is that a lot of things that humans assumed were commons have now become privatized effectively. I don't know if, am I actually on the screen? I don't seem to be at the moment. Can you hear me? Okay, we're fine.
We can see you and hear you.
Okay, sorry, I was just looking at someone who looked very mystified, as though I was saying nothing. Okay, so we have this issue of that we've been destroying commons, things that all humans assumed were theirs, have in fact been turned into commercial zones which belong to people. And in fact, we're now sort of doing that with space. We're closing off space to the ordinary human. In fact, what I fear is that we're building a sort of cage around the Earth. If it's going to be 250,000 satellites, as I think Ruth said is possible, or even 500,000 satellites, doesn't that effectively confine us to this planet, not only psychologically, but physically as well? We won't be able to fly through that barrier. You know, if the amount of space junk that we can predict there is extrapolatable from what already exists, then we will have a sort of impenetrable barrier where most forms of vision and travel outside of our planet are prohibited. So this is one, it's a pragmatic problem, this. Are we caging ourselves in? But for me, the more important question is, are we caging ourselves in psychologically? Are we actually creating a smaller universe for ourselves? Are we shutting off the possibilities of actually feeling that larger universe? Now, because I'm an artist, I think that feeling is the beginning of thinking. I don't think it works the other way around. I think we feel first, and feeling is a form of thinking. And I think there is something very important about the fact that humans look into the night sky and feel their own tininess and insignificance and the amazingness of the universe that we're part of. I think we're closing that off. We're shutting that feeling off. We're saying, let's just carry on with the babble we've got here on Earth, and let's make it even more efficient. Now we can babble with even less latency and in even more obscure places. I'm not against babbling. I do quite a lot of it myself, but I also like the thought of going out into nothingness and looking into the darkness. So I won't talk for longer because I know there's a lot to say about this, but Timiebi is right that this is a legal problem, partly a legal issue. And I would just want to say, let's not do to space what we've done to the oceans and to the great rainforests. Can't we just learn from those experiences and say, why don't we treat space like Antarctica? Why don't we say, it's a commons, we should share it, and we should make sure that it can be shared for a long time.
Thank you. And thank you for keeping to time. Okay, our last question is a long one. This is for Aparna. As we examine how astrophysicists, observatories, and other stakeholders are working to get the ear of the creators of these satellite constellations, it is poetic how there are parallels to the desire of indigenous communities that are contesting the continued use of their sacred mountaintops for astronomical purposes. This brings into question indigeneity and culture, and not only the right to the night sky, but the right to their ways of accessing the sky. Of particular concern is the classic false dichotomy of tradition versus progress, upon which first indigenous people and now astrophysicists are on the losing side. Can you speak about what you have learned from your work with indigenous communities that can help us destabilize this false dichotomy, as well as give voice to shared and dissenting positions in the satellite constellation discussions? Aparna.
Thank you.
You have 4
so much,
minutes, Aparna.
Jarita, thank you. I want to begin by respectfully acknowledging those whose ancestral homelands I am speaking to you from, the Coast Miwok and Ohlone of Northern California, as well as the traditional custodians of the land where each of you are. I also honor that 2020 brought us as a planet and species to an existential crossroads we have been approaching for some time, and that we are still navigating a time in which we are losing too many elders, especially in the most vulnerable communities. So I express my gratitude to the organizers of this event for holding the space and intentionality to discuss our shared elder space itself. Jarita, I agree. It's a painful irony that in studying orbital mechanics and radiation, that understanding is now built into technology that might actually hold up astronomers. And I think it's also a painful irony that it's come around to astronomy. Our institutions and facilities were and continue to be built on indigenous lands. And that is now threatened. Astronomy is threatened by the very real, very rapid occupation of near-Earth space by the satellite industry. And I'm especially grateful for this space because we've been a little slow to arrive at this. You know, our pace was, for Tolkien fans, entish, but we've now arrived and into dialogue. And the SatCon industry is very fast, but they're also capable of fast responsiveness. So we're hopeful of good collaboration. And I know after this past year, many of us are impatient to resume life and business as usual. But let's keep in mind that the constituency for space is humanity itself, and that space is an ancestral global commons, not just a global commons, but an ancestral global commons for all of our shared practices, scientific, cultural. And this is a really radical perspective shift for us ahead of policies to move away from viewing time and space as a scarce commodity needing a lot of heavy management. And I want to honor my collaborators and my work with Indigenous communities who model the partnerships that I'd love to see unfold in our approach to space that include and integrate our many human identities and knowledge systems. And they have shown me the wisdom and great need for a relational, ethical approach to space rather than a transactional, extractive approach. Indigenous knowledge is inherently interdisciplinary, multi-generational, and integrative, expressed through sustainable practices. This isn't just a nice idea. We actually direly need this approach given the existential crossroads we're at. And the realm of space agencies and billionaire investors exploring space, this is the heart of what makes us human. It isn't just the realm of these space agencies and private companies. All of our ancestors have been scientists and explorers, and it's the heart of what makes us human. And we have so much to learn from all traditions. So my respectfully offered thought is that we focus more on how we get there rather than being the first to get there, and that we ask who and what we are losing in gaining the stars in the current approach. And I'll end with advocating and joining you for moving away from divisive dualities, professional astronomy versus other constituents, rural versus urban, science versus culture. We can create the space for nuanced dialogues with communities and listen to them about what satellite mega constellations could bring them and may take away. What are their options and what alternatives are they considering? This isn't hard for us as physicists. We are used to paradoxes at the heart of reality. We can do this. For example, an electron we know acts as a wave and as a particle, and we know that we force a limited outcome. We choose one, choose one identity, something not reflective of a very complex whole, only through a measurement. So I'll end with this sentence, that science is inseparable from the cultural paradigms and values driving that science. And like the electrons, let's integrate that. Let's not have to choose.
Thank you so much, Aparna. Okay, so Andy, confirm that we have 2 minutes for questions.
Yeah, there's been some fascinating questions, so we should certainly pick a few. I think. All
right, who's my question picker?
It's Mark.
Yeah, hi, just a very specific one to Brian first. the question is whether or not there is justification using art projects involving satellites, of which there have been several proposed and some launched over the years, as a way of engaging people to look at that contemplation of the universe, or whether that just sort of undermines the issue that we're addressing more globally here. Do you think it's valid to use art on satellites at this point, or should we just eschew that?
I'm not familiar enough with any of those projects to answer in any detail. There is a sort of slight contradiction possible in doing that. And I don't currently imagine that as an important extension of this argument. I think for me, the important thing is using art to honor the fact that we share lots of things together and to find ways of sharing them, not to find ways of fencing them off and keeping them for ourselves. Now, if those projects you're talking about help to do that, then I would support them. But I think it's something that artists are very aware of at the moment and are certainly doing in global terms, in Earth terms. I'm hoping that we'll start looking to the stars and thinking the same way about them as well.
Great. And one more question from Catherine Courtney came a little bit earlier on, and it's a rather global question, so I welcome anybody to pitch in. We don't just have a minute left. How do we engage younger people with this topic? This is a question for their futures as much as we are responsible for what's going on. I think about my own children here, and I'm not sure they're particularly engaged at all. They're not listening to this evening. They're just thinking Dad's doing what Dad's doing as usual. But it's vital because it's their world. This is, of course, a huge issue in many ways, climate change and many other global challenges. So Timyebi, maybe you would like to jump in there.
Yeah, so I think that sustainability is like a hot topic right now. So like, for instance, in my school, which is the College of Global Futures, we also have a College of Sustainability. And it's just the amount of people that are realizing that we have to take a holistic approach to the way we do things. We can't, for instance, say, oh, because the space environment is so far away, we don't have to have a sustainable way that we look at it. And so if we bring in that language of space, that actually it's just another area that is pretty close to what we do. And if we have to always think, holistically about what we do on Earth, then kind of why not in the space context? And as this sustainability becomes a more dynamic career, I think we just have to get that topic associated with space more than we do. And I think the space sustainability dialogue that we've had so far has been too focused on security. And so people feel like security is like really far away from me. But if you say, no, it's about environment and we're going to have more activities in space and more things are going to be affected, then more people are going to feel connected to that. So that's how I think we get the youth involved.
Great. Andy, I think it's time to hand back to you for the next session.
So thank you all our speakers. Handing it back to Andy.
Thank you. That really was an amazing session, as I hoped it would be. Let's move on to part 4, which in some ways is the trendiest section, because a lot of people have been hearing about space debris and junk and what's going on. Just to briefly kind of show you the personnel here. So this is going to be chaired by Jonathan McDowell, and we have some excellent people, Moriba Jar, Hugh Lewis, and Alan Thompson. So I'm going to hand over to you, Jonathan. Let's talk about space junk.
Indeed. Yes, there's a lot of junk out there. What is space junk? And I'm really, let me just introduce myself. I'm an astronomer at the Center for Astrophysics, Harvard and Smithsonian, part of the Chandra Space Telescope team, but also the author of Jonathan's Space Report, a satellite newsletter on the internet. And my first question is going to be to Professor Moriba Jar from the University of Texas at Austin, who is an expert on astrodynamics and space tracking. And so, Moriba, we haven't had a big orbital collision in over 10 years. So why do you think it's a problem? Is it really a problem?
Yeah, thank you so much. Hello to everybody present, and hopefully everybody is safe and healthy. Look, I think that there's the whole unknown unknowns. I mean, clearly we see when there's an increase in trackable stuff in the US catalog for sure, and other people's databases. So we can kind of tell when things break up. Yeah, we haven't had a big collision since then, but I think it's less of a matter of if, but rather when we're kind of due, especially with the increase in traffic. And certainly, I think that people tend to focus on the debris creation, specifically on collisions, and that's like the big thing dominating people's, radars, pun intended. But I think that people just don't include the fact that things do explode, and we've actually seen a few explosions just in the past few years of larger rocket bodies that have created lots of debris in geotransfer orbits that, oh, by the way, now this is a highway of junk that's going to connect to geo as the geotransfer orbit precesses, due to perturbations. And also, the fact that objects age in space in ways that we fully don't understand, and things break up on their own. So things, glue isn't meant to last forever, and due to thermal cycling and material fatigue, things crack and they just break apart. Maybe they weren't designed out of unobtainium. So I think these are some critical things that people need to take into account, and that's why it's important.
Thanks, Mariba. And I'm going to ask Professor Hugh Lewis from the University of Southampton. He's an expert on space debris modeling and serves on the Interagency Space Debris Committee. And Hugh, first I want to ask you, is there a real danger of a chain reaction like in the movie Gravity?
Hello, Jonathan. Thanks very much for the question. It's a really good question. It's one that I get a lot, actually. So I'd like to make a distinction really between what was depicted in the film Gravity, which actually is a story over 90 minutes. If you try to follow the physics of how this process might work, you'd be sitting in that movie theater probably for some hundreds or thousands of years waiting for it to happen. But the depiction actually was probably not too dissimilar from what you might see. Now, a really good way to imagine this is to imagine a domino toppling world record, okay, where you've lined up lots of dominoes, you knock one, and then you wait to see all the dominoes fall over. Now, lots of people think of that as your typical collision cascade. You need one collision to happen, and then you get this chain reaction of collisions that take place. But the reality is, it is not really like that. Another analogy is popcorn. When you cook popcorn in a pan, everything gets warmed up, and then all of a sudden, all of the kernels just burst. Okay, and again, that's at another extreme as well. And the reality of the Kessler syndrome is probably somewhere in the middle. It's probably more like you trying this world record domino toppling event and, having lots of false starts and having bits and pieces of the pattern you've laid out on the floor falling over at different times, not when they're supposed to, and so on. So it's a real problem that we can expect to see collisions that will trigger other collisions. But my expectation is that we don't see this really long chain of collisions taking place.
Thank you. And now I want to introduce, sorry, I lost it, Alan Thompson, who is the head of government affairs of the British rocket launch company Skyrora. Very exciting, and he has an extensive background in international trade and development. Alan, you represent a launch operator. Is it going to be hard to launch things with all of this traffic going overhead?
I think that's a very good question. It's a challenge, and I'm delighted to be part of this discussion today, and thank you very much for the invitation. The approach that we're taking to that is actually through responsibility and the collaboration, and a number of themes that have been mentioned by colleagues earlier on this evening. I think, particularly from the point of view of Skyrora, we believe that the way to go is to come up with a code of responsibility for the launch partners that we are looking to assist into low Earth orbit.
And that, I suppose, that's the beginnings of our thoughts. Obviously, we're still waiting for the UK regulations to come into force to be able to do that on a regular basis. And we're hoping that that will be from, again, the end of 2022 when we'll finally get to start launching. But yeah, I do believe that at the moment, obviously the sheer numbers of space debris, and indeed, I think the image that Andy shared at the very beginning of an item of space debris hitting into the International Space Station and causing the dent, I think obviously we're talking about debris which is larger than 10 centimeters, which is probably the most impactful. But I do believe at the moment that there is still sufficient space, there's still sufficient area up there that it will not be a challenge to start launching. But I do believe that going forward, again, referring to some colleagues' comments about replacing one satellite up, one down, that's something that Skyrora specifically is looking into doing, which is also to removing satellites from orbit, utilizing a third stage that we have, which is coming to be an orbital maneuvering vehicle. So I think we're erring very much on the side of responsibility. We're very keen to play our part and actually to engage to understand what and to measure the risk, to understand the risk better, both on a side of trying to get into a practical side of things, tangible. How can we measure this risk, and yet at the same time to react and not to be the antagonists to the astronomers out there and just irresponsible behavior of launching satellites into orbit.
Thanks. And I think I may have accidentally cut Mariba off, so I want to ask him a quick follow-up. When you look at, Mariba, when you look at space as an environment, what is the carrying capacity of low Earth orbit? How many satellites do you think we can safely get up there?
Look, I think it's a mixture of number of objects and the uncertainty with which we understand where they're at and where they're going to be. So it's a combination of things. For sure, you know, from the European Space Agency, we've seen a kind of a concept, the definition of orbital capacity and mission index, which is similar to an idea, you know, that I've tossed out there with like a space traffic footprint, which would be like a carbon footprint analog, some sort of composite index that brings in size, maneuverability, and all these things into it. I think in order for us to come up with, because look, the carrying capacity in the air, that's pretty common across the globe, but it wasn't always, right? It's like if you have better radar systems and that sort of stuff, the carrying capacity over your airspace is much better than over somebody who's just like looking outside the window with binoculars or something. So the thing is, we have to come up with what a standard observer and that sort of stuff is. And then based on these standard definitions, we can come up with a carrying capacity and say, look, let's define the carrying capacity as being exceeded when, I don't know, we experience 10% every month of losses, disruptions, or degradations of services that we can't prevent. Our decisions cannot prevent these things that are undesirable from happening. Therefore, the carrying capacity of this orbit has been exceeded or is saturated. And in the context of the carrying capacity, then I think we can start talking about allocating capacity in a way that is reminiscent of how the ITU allocates spectrum.
Thanks. And rather than ask the panelists directly more questions, I know we have a lot of great questions coming in on the chat. So I'm going to ask Rita to shoot.
Right. Okay. So from Joseph Sibera, apart from legal definitions of space junk, the junk will be made by private companies dominantly. Who is expected to pay for the removal? Public? What do the experts expect in this? Anyone respond?
I can take a first stab, but I think Mariba has probably got a really good response to this already. But so my feeling is that the companies need to take a leadership role. So spacecraft operators, especially the constellation operators, they are going to set the tone for how we behave and look after the space environment. And I think there are some really good strides being made by some of the companies looking forwards, you know, looking at what happens if their spacecraft fail, how do we deal with this? So that I think that's first and foremost one of the best things that we can do is have these operators taking the lead in looking after the environment and using foresight to understand what problems might exist in the future. But beyond that, I'm going to defer to my co-panelists here to probably give you a bit of a better answer.
You know, I have to say, Hugh, I love your answer. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that governments need to step up in a major way. I mean, if you know, space law kind of says that you know, state parties to these treaties have liability over damage and harmful interference, and you know, at the same time, these states you know, are the ones that have to provide authorization and continuing supervision of activities. You know, I think the companies need to be beholden to the states that authorize them, and those states have to come up with their own, you know, national laws and enforce these things and hold people accountable, and do that in a way that's transparent, that shows the world that they are doing that sort of stuff. But I just don't see people rushing to do that.
And if I can, I would add to that and just suggest that it's through collaboration, it's through a unity and demonstration of behaviors by leading by example that I think we're going to achieve that. So it's very much to Hugh's point and to Mariba's point, it's through collaboration and having the confidence that we can actually achieve and demonstrate how we should be being responsible. So I think a lot of it is also in the constellation companies themselves and how they demonstrate that responsibility.
All right, there's a couple of questions about the effect on our atmosphere. We're talking about the light pollution, but both, I think it's Jonathan Code and Deborah are asking questions about what happens to our ozone and our atmosphere as they're launching these satellites. Can any of our panelists speak to that?
So yes, I think from my side, being the launch vehicle manufacturer and having ambitions to launch from Scotland, part of our responsibility is actually to use such platforms as well to demonstrate what it is we're doing and why we think we are trying to demonstrate that responsible approach to launch. The fuelstuffs that we are using, utilizing hydrogen peroxide as the oxidizer, actually, as I'm sure a lot of people understand, produce a significant reduced carbon emissions for launch itself. So we're anticipating, I think, an average of a year's worth of launches to be less than an aircraft flight from London to Washington one way. So that's kind of the size of the emissions. We're also utilizing unrecycled plastic, so landfill plastic, as the base for creating an RP1 equivalent, so the rocket propellant one. So this is the kind of like the beginnings of the environmental standards that we're challenging ourselves with. We think that this is a reasonable place to start from, but at the same time, we believe that starting from this, we are looking to have continuous improvement and make a greater effect on contributing to net zero, to reducing the emissions and actually to making that happen. I think the second question also refers to a point that was made, I think, slightly earlier on in the discussions this evening about an environmental impact assessment for undertaking this activity in the Broad. And I believe, as I think we've heard already, there hasn't been one for specifically for SpaceX and the Starlink constellations that were put up there. And I think very much in collaboration with colleagues across the UK, Skyrora and other companies, and indeed with the support of people such as Hugh and Mariba, we are looking to try to challenge ourselves to come up to answer that question of coming up with an environmental impact assessment about the activity that we're doing, so that we understand exactly what the extent of the, delivering satellites into low Earth orbit, what the extent of having a space orbiting maneuvering vehicle would be, and how can we do it in a responsible way such that we can actually return and come back with some specific answers and share that with the more general public.
Does anyone else want to speak to that?
Yeah, look, I mean, at the end of the day, we need to do science. And the thing is, one of the things that I've seen, unfortunately, with time is, climate change people don't necessarily understand or even want to consider space, again, as an environment that needs environmental protection. And so that's an issue. And whenever people say, okay, well, if you want to know this stuff, you have to measure it. And so we actually need to get some science funded on this stuff. People keep on saying, you know what, that sounds really hard. Like, can you guarantee that you're going to be successful in the next 2 to 3 years? Well, no, because it's, science. Oh, well, it's like everybody wants off the shelf science, right? Science that will guarantee victory, where the line of sight of the return on investment is like in the 2 to 3 year time span. And it's like gone are the days when people just invested in science for the long-term return to just see, yeah, where does this go and what is it and what's going to happen. And so I'm very fearful of scientific investment these days because people just don't want to do it anymore.
That's a good lead in, I think, if we just wrap up in 30 seconds to ask Hugh to say a little about his discovery that climate change actually has an effect on the lifetimes of space junk.
Thanks, Jonathan. So actually, not my discovery at all. So this is something actually that's been put forward several decades ago, in fact. What we've discovered is that the atmosphere where the satellites are operating is contracting downwards, so the density is decreasing. That's increasing lifetimes, not just of the operational satellites, but the debris. And that is effectively going to lead to a faster rate of growth of the debris population. And how fast? Quite a lot faster. I mean, the atmosphere is, as it turns out, is shrinking at a rate of about between about 6 and 10% per decade, which is pretty rapid. So we'd expect to see in 100 years' time, based on the concentration pathways that we're following, density where the International Space Station is at about 50% of what it is today.
Thanks. And I think we should probably hand it back to Andy at this point.
Yeah, thank you. And we're moving to the kind of culmination of this event, really. I just want to say briefly, first though, for the public, what you won't know is that in the chat window of the Zoom call, there's lots of fascinating points being made by various participants that we don't have time to entirely address, but they will be saved. And when we have the recorded version on YouTube, we'll make sure that everything is available for public consumption, as it were. Likewise, for the public chat on the YouTube chat relay, that's, obviously we're not going to get everything through there. Okay, so on to the last section. This is part 5. So having gone through all the problems and trying to understand what the satellite operators are up to, there's a kind of feeling that regulations are stuck in the 1960s and were not made for the world of SpaceX, Elon Musk, etc. So that's what we want to talk about. What do we do? What do we have to do about space foreign policy? So Catherine Courtney is going to chair this session. We have a great panelists here. We have Chris Newman, Stefano Galozzi, Nicholas Heydman, and Brian Whedon. So let's get on with it, and I'll hand over to Catherine.
Thanks, Andy. Make sure I've taken myself off mute. I'm going to do a really quick run through this panel because it is a pretty remarkable panel. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm Catherine Courtney. I'm the chair of the Global Network on Sustainability in Space, the former UK space regulator as the former CEO of the UK Space Agency. But in respect of this topic, for me, more importantly, I'm not a subject matter expert. I'm more really just a concerned citizen and a parent of 3 small children. I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Newman, Professor of Space Law and Policy from Northumbria University, Brian Whedon, Director of Program Planning for the Secure World Foundation, and Nicholas Heydman, the Chief of Policy and Legal Affairs for the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, and Stefano Galozzi from the Italian National Institute of Astrophysics. So without further ado, let me go straight to the subject matter experts. Chris, could you please give the listeners a very brief introduction to relevant aspects of current space law?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, everybody. It's a real genuine honor to be amongst such distinguished people, very humbling for me to be amongst such distinguished experts. And what I'm going to do is talk about the governance of outer space. We tend to talk about space law, but I prefer to talk about space governance because the law is actually only a part of it. So let's start right at the top table, if you like, of space law, the international treaty commitment of states. Now, as Andy said right at the start, these are relatively, compared to space activity, these are relatively old instruments. We have the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which, we've already talked about. We've already talked about how that imposes obligations on nation states. It imposes freedom to explore, freedom to use, freedom to scientifically investigate, but it puts limitations on them. And it imposes what I call the liability or the accountability triangle. So you have Article 6, international responsibility for space activity lies with nation states. So it's nation states who are internationally responsible. Then we have this notion of launching states. States who actually launch stuff up there, they're internationally liable for the damage caused by their space objects to other state parties. And then we have jurisdiction and control granted where there's registration of a space object. So that's, if you like, the top tier. Then underneath that, as a result of these obligations, we then have national space legislation, usually where the regulation sits, usually where regulators live and where they authorize space missions. And then we have another dimension to this, the non-treaty agreements, the things that aren't necessarily binding law, but that are very, going to be persuasive, and they're going to influence national regulators. So we think about the UN debris mitigation guidelines as the sort of the premier amongst them, but we've got the ISO standards, we've got industry best practice. Now, just to very quickly summarize, what we've got here is a collision almost. We've got a horizontal international legal system. States can't force states to do anything they don't want to. In a vertical system, where a national system where we have the government and we have penal institutions and we have law enforcement, they can force me to do something. On an international level, that enforcement becomes really difficult. So I really like Mariba's statement about off-the-shelf science. Well, off-the-shelf law, it's very tempting to think we can get a law that can cover everything and that can deal with everything. But as Nicholas is going to tell you, international treaty negotiations, they take a long time. As Brian's going to tell you, the geopolitics of this is immensely complex. It's not just a question of a law that's going to enforce, what we want. We're going to have to do a lot of public pressure on this. We're going to have to get to our elected representatives. That's where the pressure points are. The law, that'll come later.
Thanks, Chris. Well, you've set that up perfectly to hand the virtual mic to Brian. Brian, what is wrong with the current state of affairs? Why don't today's space governance mechanisms work?
Well, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. And just to build on what Chris was talking about, one of the key challenges is sort of how this stuff is operationalized at the national level. Just for example, here in the United States, which is licensing some, but not all of these large constellations, the regulators, the institutions that are responsible to license things are not set up to deal with a topic such as light pollution. And it's not obvious that that is something that is required for them to do. The primary regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, is set up to license radio frequency spectrum use. And that is what they're good at. That's what their expertise at. And in fact, there has been an international discussion for the last several years coordinating the RF spectrum aspects of these large constellations. But there is not a similar mechanism or institutions or existing process to deal with the light pollution aspect of it. So what we're dealing with here is a situation where there's just not the pathways, the capacity for governments to even really deal with this aspect of light pollution, and it's they don't have time for it, right? Because these constellations are already being launched, already putting up, and as Chris mentioned, not only does the international treaties take a long time, but so does building governmental capacity to regulate. That takes a long time as well.
I'll just ask you a quick follow-up on that, Brian. So what I've observed around the world is that some signatories to the OSA agreement haven't managed to introduce any national level space law. and where there are regulators. And at the minute, for instance, the US, the UK, we're in the process of changing regulatory authorities and shifting it to new institutions who may or may not have the funding and skills to exercise those duties. Could you talk a little bit about that? It seems to be that you've reflected on that in your remarks.
Yeah, so that's the other big challenge here. So Chris mentioned this concept of launching states, and under the Article 6 jurisdiction, there can be multiple countries that are potentially liable and thus might have to have some sort of oversight role over these companies or these activities. And then it's inherent for each of those countries to put in place a national regulatory regime, and that's difficult to do. Even advanced countries like the United States, as I just said, don't have what I would call a very broad regime that covers all of these new and emerging things, particularly because the commercial industry is coming up with new ways and to use space that very quickly. And so even large countries like the US and the UK, or say advanced countries, are struggling to deal with that. So this gets back to this question of, even if there is a new international treaty, how does that get operationalized through the national implementation? That itself is going to take a very long time, and something that lots of countries are going to have to grapple with. Just a very quick point to finish on. One of these large constellations, AST Space Mobile, is the primary regulator is actually Papua New Guinea. That is who has the spectrum license for them. And that's a country that now has to put in place some sort of regulatory regime to keep a track of all these things.
Very interesting. Now I'm going to throw a question over to first to Nicholas and then to Stefano to get the astronomer's perspective on this. Stefano, the question I have is, what needs to be done? What can we do? How can we fix the governance in order to preserve space for future generations? Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Can you hear me well? Yeah, good, excellent. Well, the question is, what would we like to do and what can we do, you see? And this is really the crux of the matter and the problem that we have seen in this webinar so far. If we look at the space law, international space law, as a whole, with the treaties, with the resolutions, the set of principles, guidelines, everything, it's dealing predominantly with activities in outer space. So the space law, international space law, is not really dealing with astronomy from Earth. However, astronomical observations from installations in outer space or in the future from celestial bodies would be covered naturally, but not from Earth. And this is really leading into the complexity of what we are discussing here and the frustration. Now, Chris said something very interesting, giving a perspective of the history of space law making. I would just like to picture this. Look at this as a time scale. 20 years in making the treaties. The 5 UN treaties on outer space took more or less 20 years. From 1963 with the declaration to the Moon Agreement 1979. And then 20 years of dealing with principles that are non-legally binding, but nevertheless, in a little way, closer to treaty lawmaking, but they are nevertheless non-legally binding. 20 years. And after that came a period of 20 years in looking into implementation of the rights and obligations of the treaty. So there we have all those guidelines, space debris mitigation guidelines, and ending in 2019 with the long-term sustainability guidelines. Definitely non-legally binding. The question is, what next? And I just want to make a point here that we heard earlier, and also from IAU perspective, that it was presented only a few weeks ago to our scientific and technical subcommittee, a proposal for recommendations generated by IAU, several states, and also the Office for Outer Space Affairs in a cooperation. There was no consensus. So now there is a mandate for the Office for Outer Space Affairs to work with IAU, work with the states that are interested, in particular Spain, because we are planning an activity, a workshop in October, to form a basis, a proposed basis for how dark and quiet skies could be integrated into the agenda of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee in 2022, hopefully. So it's still, it's just part of diplomacy. part of multilateralism, but it could be, I say, the first time that astronomy and the whole issue, the whole spectrum of dark and quiet skies could enter into the formal agenda of this unique intergovernmental body. So let's see.
Well, that's heartening to hear. Stefano.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I have to say that I'm an astronomer. I'm not a lawyer, and I totally agree with other speakers and for whatever is related to the international treaties and so on. The point here is not what we would like to do, just because we are from our small sides. What we can do just so I can explain my experience, because from the astronomer side, I personally approached to the problem of the mega constellations of satellites, because I am also very active in environmental issues. So just because I have been president of an Italian environmental protection committee for years, and so I collected a series of intervention strategies which, in my opinion, when they are correctly implemented, they can manage to block or at least slow down any speculative project. So even when we can say that in our experience there is a very great interest in companies, corporation, and private investments, even in these cases, we can do something. In particular, in January 2020, I was the promoter of a petition called Appeal by Astronomers. This is just an action to raise the awareness from the astronomical community, because if even I was an astronomer, this kind of discussion was done only at political side of the astronomical community. So it is important to understand that this action of awareness has collected about more than 2,000 signatures from colleagues who supported from more than 50 countries all around the world. But what we express here is the fact that we don't talk of mitigation procedure to minimize problem and threats on astronomical observation. What we would like to obtain is just to avoid the problems, because we are not intended to collaborate or coordinate efforts in order to minimize some problems, but we are working from 1,000 years on these kinds of professions. So we would like to continue to do so. In particular, we also take account on legal issues, because the political side is not on our effort, and in particular we used the Healthy Haven Trust Initiative, which is a spontaneous initiative of a legal international network of lawyers aimed by noble environment protection purpose, and they filed out a petition for review to the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, for expedited rulemaking and an opposition on the FCC approval of elevation modification. This review is pending to the FCC, but the next step is just to sue in court, even to the International Court of Justice, because if you take care to make the pronunciation like Viasat on a federal court of justice, a federal US court of justice, This does not resolve problems from Chinese, from Russian, from Korean, and other satellite constellations. So the only way to push the international United Nations, COPOS, UNUSA, and another international institution to rulemaking on this kind of problem, just to organize better everything related to the satellites in low Earth orbit. We just have to make a pressure on International Court of Justice, which could even declare the Federal Commission and Agency, National Federal Commission and Agency authorization as to be considered unlawful. This could be a very impact action, in particular because we need just to realize this, we need to be legitimated under the International Court of Justice. So we create a foundation. This foundation called SAS Foundation, where SAS means Safeguarding the Astronomical Sky Foundation, is an international ONG under the Italian law, which was born just to have the legal legitimation on this possible legal action. So I think that our experience can help individuals from their side to join together to create a critical mass, we can say a fight of dissent, to push the politics and institution in the desired way. And maybe this could be the right way to express our dissent on something which is a threat for all the mankind.
Very interesting ideas there, and hopefully you could put link in the chat for people who want to have a look at on the web for that. As
Sorry.
Ruth Pritchard Kelly said, politics is getting in the way.
Sorry, Catherine.
But you see, and you mean you have good points, but you have to push this via your own government. You see, this is the reality we live in. This is the society we have. Rule makings are done by governments internationally, and then being implemented at the national level. So you have to influence your government. Then your government could potentially influence the intergovernmental diplomacy.
How do we encourage a race to the top then between licensing nations? Because we do see this this license hopping behavior, you know, on the part of satellite operators. If they find one regulator is asking too many questions, they can always go and get a flag of convenience from somewhere else. Brian?
So, you know, that is a possibility, but it may not be that dire because there's something else called market access rules. So, for example, all these companies, if they want to sell these services in the United States, they must get a license from the FCC. So those countries that have big markets where these companies want the services, they do have some power. So maybe not the Chinese constellation, but probably pretty much every other one is going to have to get or want a license from the FCC. So there are probably same thing in Europe as well, from some of the several major European countries. So that does provide the opportunity for a couple of countries to have a role here. But then the problem still becomes convincing those countries to do something and implement something.
Andy, I'm going to just check our time because I know that your event is running over, but I'd love to take some of the questions from the participants.
So we've got some great questions. So lots of concern about how much time it's going to take to legalize this. Brian Eno saying that the law is just not going to be fast enough here. He's saying, do we need Extinction Rebellion to set up a space department? And Chris, you've talked before about a Greenpeace for space. Is that realistic? Do we need people to take this sort of action?
Yeah, I think we do, because I think absolutely, as Brian said, as Hugh said, there isn't the time to go through a lengthy legal procedure. I see in the chat a number of discussions about, can we sue them for this? Can we, go and get the government to do this? The law isn't going to give you the answer that you want here. The law will come from the public pressure, from an awareness that this is something important. It goes back to what Timmy was saying. We have to win this as an argument. We have to win this as an argument, and then that becomes something that we can use to influence governments. Because like Nicholas said, it's going to be the governments that are going to be doing this. They're going to be making the legislation here, that are going to be making international agreements on this. I've talked with numbers of colleagues. I see Thomas Cheney's in the participants list as well. And we've talked about this before, how Friends of Space or Greenpeace could be, a way of recognizing this as a real sort of important thing that gets it up the politicians' list, because there are so many things right now on the politicians' lists. COVID, the economic recovery from COVID. We've got to compete with that type of discussion. And we can do that because, we're all here because of the magic of space, because we've been infused with that magic. We've got to try and get that message.
The FCC has already approved Starlink to launch 12,000 of these things. Is there any way we can suspend those launches? This is a question from Ian Smith. Can we pause this? Can we put a moratorium on new space launch whilst treaties and laws are being negotiated? Is there any way to pause what's already in motion?
There's a way to pause, one or two, but don't forget, China are doing it, Russia are doing it. There are going to be other countries doing this as well. We need a more sustainable approach. We need an approach that's going to be recognized, across the world. One jurisdiction can do something, but everybody together, that's the way we've got to approach this.
And just quickly to add on to that, that is initial approval given by the FCC, pending SpaceX providing additional documentation on how they're going to do their post-mission disposal and debris mitigation. There's also the bringing into use aspect of it. So they are required to have a certain percent of the constellation up by a certain date in order to retain their spectrum access rights.
And there's also a wonderful new article on Scientific America today that people might look at, reporting about a court case that's just going to.
May I ask one point in this regard very quickly, because this is an interesting discussion, also feeding into what we have heard earlier in the webinar. I don't want to put anyone down, but there won't be any new legally binding instruments in the foreseeable future. Forget it. There is no consensus among the major spacefaring nations in that regard. So it's just to forget. And then we have to work on what are the tools we can apply to make the best of the situation. And we cannot forget that political pressure is also quite powerful. And in developing non-legally binding instruments, I'm a lawyer myself. I love treaty law, of course I do. But non-legally binding instruments in the form of guidelines might be the best we can achieve. And it has to come with political buy-in from governments. And don't underestimate also what is being done by other organizations closely connected to the United Nations. For instance, COSPAR, the Panel on Planetary Protection, which is operational and really is the, per definition, hub of buy-in from the major spacefaring nations on planetary protection requirements for their planetary missions. And that is done by a non-governmental organization. And it's a system that works. So there is hope. And what I said earlier, that now we will see next year in the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee if we can get a consensus on moving forward on dark and quiet skies. Because if we get that into the agenda of this intergovernmental body, then we have an impetus to continue discussing all those topics that we have addressed here today.
It was, I know there's been a lot of commentary, but it was very welcome to see the G7 declaration on Sunday on space sustainability, and we have the opportunity at COP26 and the G20, et cetera, to keep putting that on world leaders' agenda. I think probably nobody would have predicted 10 years ago that China would be in a race to the top on environmental concerns, and I think we've seen some amazing results from public pressure, from our Sir David Attenborough's, making it visible, making these problems visible, from Greta Thunberg. And I do believe that actually raising public awareness through events like this one, thank you, Andy, for inviting us all to participate, is a critical way of, helping the public to visualize the issues and get more involved. I'm going to pass the floor back to you, Andy, for you to ask questions or wrap up or whatever it is that you choose to do.
We've been going for 2 hours, which I think is about the end of public patience, so we should probably wrap up. But I just wanted to pick up on that last point first. Thank you for saying that this is the right thing to increase public awareness. I really do believe that. And we've heard a lot of the wise heads here in the space governance area say, don't wait for the law to magically fix this for you. That's not going to happen. And if things do in the real world happen through governments, but don't be pessimistic, because governments do, in most countries at least, governments do listen to their people and to public pressure. And if you write letters or make a fuss, every time you write a letter to an MP or congressman, they assume there's another 1,000 people behind you. So, making your feelings known really matters, and nothing will happen unless we make public pressure. And so I think that is the right thing to do. Picking up on the G7 and their pledge, I think there's a kind of, we should catch the momentum, ride this wave, as it were. So it's fantastic that the G7 did make this public pledge, this commitment. But we all know it's typical politics, that it's nice words, but let's see some action. What does it really mean? And it is rather conspicuous that in referring to the existing guidelines, there's a kind of assumption it's all business as usual. There was no mention in that statement about mega constellations and the fact that satellite launches are increasing by factors of several tens. Okay, and that is the issue. I'll tell you what it put me in mind of. It's like one of those government campaigns where they say, you must all be good and pick up your litter. And we think, yeah, okay, that's good. But what you should really be saying is, no, please stop making the plastic. And that's really, I think, the message we should be getting through to our own governments. But there is momentum, I think, that we can use. Two more things from me, then I will shut up. I think there clearly is, I've picked up from this meeting, a real sense of a growing sense of space environmentalism. We've got to kind of crystallize what that really means and do it. But people, scientists, ordinary people, lawyers, astronautics people are all being very serious about this, and we've got to push that through. So I really want to see that happen. And nobody is saying, I think, that astronomy is more important than the internet. This is a much bigger problem. And as we heard our Viasat and OneWeb people say, you can do this in a kind of sensible way and think about it and really do it properly. And I'm looking forward to that. The final thing that I think answers this takes a long time, improve culture, regulations, governance, etc. I think what we're looking at here is partly a kind of warm-up for much bigger problems that can happen to humanity in the next few decades. We've got to get our act together in what is an understanding by people, by governments, etc., what is good things and bad things to do in space. Because pretty soon, mining on the moon, asteroid mining, settlements on Mars, people saying we don't need to obey any government, there's going to be some horrific issues coming out in the next few decades. And I just think we better get our act together and understand how to behave in space before all that happens. So that was a bit of a long speech there, but as the organizer of the event, I thought I'd take my privilege to do that wrapping up. I will just finally say thank you to all the participants, the panelists, for coming. I'll say again to the public, I know that we've missed out on a lot of the fascinating chat that's been going on in YouTube, and also the public have not been seeing all the chat that's been going on in the Zoom chat window. So we'll try and make that public. this all will be available on YouTube. Let's to look out for that soon. So thank you to the public. Thank you to all the panelists. Jonathan, if you're there, could you say a very brief word about the SATCON workshop? Some people will be interested.
Right. So the SATCON 2 workshop is happening in July. And for particularly anyone who's really interested in joining the movement to push this forward, astronomers are organizing a broad-based meeting with a lot of community involvement, and Aparna and others who've been at this meeting are heavily involved. So if you Google that SATCON 2, we'll have a really interesting meeting in July.
Yeah, and I also wanted to pass briefly to Brian Whedon to tell us a little bit about next week and the Secure World Foundation Summit.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we're having our annual Summit for Space Sustainability next week, where we're going to talk about a wide range of topics. One of them is this issue of what do we do about these mega constellations? I think we're framing it as sort of the train has left the station. They're up there. How do we deal with them? How do we manage the spectrum issues, the debris issues, the collision issues, the light pollution issues that they may represent as in the coming years?
Thank you very much for that, Brian. So I think, this is especially to the public. I think you can see there's real momentum in this issue. Pay attention, and I think things are going to happen. Unless there's any other last minute plugs, I'm going to pass briefly to the president of the ASE, Mark Phillips, to kind of close us up.
Well, I'd just like to reiterate Andy's thanks to everyone. I mean, that was an amazing, wide-ranging discussion, and all very passionate about your subjects. We've had amazing chat on Zoom and on YouTube as well, which we will share, as I said. We are hosting this event, but really it's Andy's mastermind behind this. I think we should thank him for organizing such a great event. It's not just what he's doing tonight, but he has put a lot of time into this. So that's fantastic, Andy. Thank you. Also, I'd like to plug his book. I've read it. It's a really good book, Losing the Sky. It's a short read, it's cheap, but it outlines all the major things that we've discussed here, and it could be one of the most important books you read this year. So I highly recommend that. Again, thank you for visiting the Astronomical Society of Edinburgh. Hopefully we'll see you in Edinburgh sometime rather than on Zoom, but unless there's anything else, Andy, I think thank you very much, and that's the end of the meeting.
Thank you.